Okay. Hi, everyone. It's 4 o'clock CET. I welcome you to the fourth webinar of the Tree Mortality Network. We're presenting today Nate McDowell, Rising Tree Mortality in the Anthropocene. So before going to actually Nate's contribution, I just want to say a few words quickly about the International Tree Mortality Network. For those who attend our seminars for the first time, it's an international interdisciplinary initiative to understand trends and causes in global tree mortality. We're trying to achieve this by combining different data sources, whether it's from remote sensing or field collected data, in order to get sort of a common construct where we can then look at trends over time and get information at larger scales, but also going all the way down to scales at the tree level. We want to identify mortality hotspots that also allow us to get information on the ecophysiological responses of trees that then feed into vegetation models in order to make realistic forecasting of future forest condition under climate change. This is a very brief sum up of what we're trying to achieve. I invite you to go to our webpage to get more information, which is an intuitive address, tree-mortality.net. We started off as an IUFRO task force on monitoring of global tree mortality patterns and trends. And we have extended by having new members, but also the new members of our core team in order to open up that task force to non-IUFRO members and to make it a little more an open access and open policy initiative. We have given ourselves a very renowned scientific advisory board. And if you look at the pictures at the bottom, you're definitely going to recognize a few of them. And among these is Nate. So our idea is that we give our scientific advisory board members the stage, but also interspersed more early career scientists that can also reach out to the international community. You can reach us also via our Twitter account, and if you have interesting reads, you can send them with the hashtag tree mortality paper. The idea with our seminar is we're looking for an interval of 4 to 6 weeks. If you do have suggestions for topics or you want to give talks yourself, you can contact us on our Google account, TreeMortNet. And please be aware, though, that we definitely will have a lineup of speakers, so you may have to wait and be patient a little bit before getting your turn. So how we're doing this, usually we have Nate, the speaker, giving a presentation of about 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer period of 15 minutes. So if you do have questions, you can send them to us via the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. If your question is not selected, we apologize. Probably we get too many of them. We try to regroup them in order to reduce the number and at the same time give responses to most of you. If there's any technical difficulties or other organizational stuff that could be relevant for us, please use the chat function and send these comments to us. So now we're going to Nate's talk. He's working at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Nate, your CV was the best kept secret out on the web. I could only see that you were at the University of Idaho, the University of Michigan, Oregon State University, but I didn't see what actually classes you took. Anyhow, you studied tree mortality since the early 2000s, focusing on mechanisms and prediction. And I put a title of one of your seminal papers that probably all of us have read, and this figure all of us have probably seen so many times during so many presentations. And I can only say here that you definitely have inspired a whole generation of scientists working on tree mortality under global change. So we're really looking forward to your new contribution to us and to the whole scientific community, Rising Tree Mortality in the Anthropocene. So you may take the stage. And thanks for doing that for us.
All right. Can you all see my screen and hear me, Henrik? I'll assume that's a yes. So thank you, Henrik, and and the task force for inviting me. It's a real honor to participate in this, what I think is an incredibly awesome series that has been developed by the International Tree Mortality Network, a series of these talks, which is shown by the attendance. It seems like people like this, and so something is very powerful has been created here, I think, and I'm excited about it. So rising tree mortality in the Anthropocene, well, I put a question mark on the end of that because we really don't know for sure if it's rising. But as I'll argue today, I think we have pretty strong evidence that at least in some regions it is. And we have some evidence to expect that it may continue. So I'd like to talk today about that issue. So specifically, why would we care about tree death? Is it increasing? Why might it be increasing? And then go into the drivers, the processes, the mechanisms, and the predictive challenges that we face. So why does increasing tree mortality matter to society? Well, this image starts us off with a nice framework to think about it visually. You have an initial state of a forest. Let's say it's at some pseudo steady state, and with growth and death in balance to some degree. And then you have a disturbance such as a drought, a harvest, a fire, an insect outbreak, or a cyclone. And this leads in the third panel to a very changed ecosystem. It may still be a forest, or it may not. But even if it is a forest still, the stature of the trees has been greatly reduced, and often the composition changes greatly. There's a lot of reasons that this matters to society, and I'll just share one for now, which is that increasing mortality reduces terrestrial carbon storage potentially. So carbon cycle equation is simple, that the storage of carbon is a function of the uptake of carbon minus the losses. So you can see simply that if mortality carbon goes up, if more trees are dying, inherently carbon storage goes down, unless carbon uptake goes up in equivalent manner. So there's either way, if mortality is increasing, it's reducing the potential carbon storage. Now, this isn't to say carbon is our only focus, or only thing that matters to us. I mean, the water cycle, nutrient cycle, biodiversity, aesthetics, forestry, tourism, etc. There's a lot of reasons why this has an impact on society. And I'll highlight one of those reasons, which is society cares about tourism is a big thing, at least in the USA. I've highlighted 4 of our national parks we have here that are devoted primarily to forests. This is an important part of our society. And if we lose these iconic trees, particularly the big ones, it does have a real significant impact on our attitude and our ability to enjoy the forest. So what evidence do we have of increasing tree mortality? This is, speaking of iconic images, this is an iconic image that Craig Allen took a photograph of in 2003, I believe, 2002 or 2003, of a widespread pine mortality throughout New Mexico. How do we measure if mortality is increasing? Well, there is what I call the gold standard, which is inventory measurements. What these are is when a team of scientists goes to a plot in the forest and measures all the trees, how big they are, their species names, and importantly, if they're alive or dead. Then those team of scientists go out repeatedly year after year or every few years for long time periods, and they're able to capture if mortality is increasing by simply seeing that it goes up. Excuse me. This is challenging because you can see on the figure on the left that, and we're talking about 1 to 2% of mortality. So that's like 1 or 2 trees out of 100 being dead. That's hard to detect, even for someone who's looking for it. But with these inventories, we're able to actually look at the changes. Now, the figure on the left shows just the regression lines from published data sets from the pubs shown on the lower right-hand side. The red lines are just straight forecasts using those linear regressions. Completely assume, just as an example of something to think about, if these are linear relationships, where might mortality be heading in the future? But of course, they may not be linear and they may change. So this is a big scientific question we have currently, is what will those patterns be in the future? But this is pretty strong evidence for an increase in mortality, at least in some regions. Now there's some indirect evidence of increasing mortality, but this could also be driven by increasing heterotrophic fluxes too. But the flattening of the terrestrial carbon sink, and you can see this on the left-hand side, we have CO2 emissions in panel A, and then we show the atmospheric growth in CO2, the land growth in CO2 in the middle, and the ocean growth in CO2 uptake on the bottom. If we just look at the land sink, if you squint, you can sort of see that it may be flattening out in the last decade or so. This could be caused certainly by a decrease in photosynthesis or an increase in heterotrophic respiration, but it can also be influenced by an increasing amount of carbon moving into the dead fraction, the necromass fraction of the ecosystem, and then becoming a source of CO2 through respiration. We need to figure out what are the controls on this land sink, which is a grand challenge many people in the society are focused on. There's also evidence from remote sensing. Here we see in the upper left-hand figure that vapor pressure deficit is rising. Vapor pressure deficit, which I will describe in detail, is basically how hot and dry the air is, or the evaporative power of the air. The higher evaporative potential, the greater the fluxes of water out of the system potentially, thus exacerbating, let's say, a drought. You can see in the lower left-hand panel that modeled photosynthesis using two different approaches, the red and the blue, suggests again that in the last decade or so, there's been a flattening of photosynthesis. So whether or not, so it could be that that's actually influencing the land sink more than the heterotrophic fluxes. And basically, I'm not going to spend time on it, but the figure on the right shows that the greenness of ecosystems has basically been going up from 82 to 98, which suggested a greening of the earth or CO2 fertilization effects, which is probably accurate. However, the trend from 99 to 2015 has actually been negative. That's why so much of it's red. So the difference between those two trends is shown in the lower figure, which basically suggests that we have a decrease in greenness over the last decade or so. Now, does that mean there's more tree mortality? It's suggestive that something is happening to impact the leaf area and the vegetation biomass in the system, but it's not conclusive. By the way, I have to note, it stays pretty green in the tropics if you look at the lower right-hand figure, which is an intriguing result, but we don't have time to go into that today. So let's move to drivers and processes. Let's think about what might be causing changes in mortality rates. So I want to highlight, before we get into the evidence that we've seen so far, I would like to highlight that there are two kinds of perturbations or disturbances that really could be involved. Those that are chronically changing, like an increase in temperature or an increase in CO2, and those that are episodic, like a drought event. So for example, the figure on the upper left shows precipitation has variability. That's the gray line. It always has and it always will. It may be changing. Droughts may be becoming more frequent. But for now, on this figure, we're assuming they're not. However, temperature and vapor pressure deficit are rising. So if we look at panel B, drought stress is now on the y-axis. We can see that these drought extremes are going up with temperature. In fact, by the middle of this century, according to this drawn figure, this schematic, we should have drought events that are going above this mortality threshold. But as you look at this, the drought events will extend both higher above the mortality threshold, and also they'll have more area above the mortality threshold till they get to the point where all these events are above the mortality threshold. Now, this is a hypothesis, but it still suggests the importance of chronic versus episodic disturbances. And you can see in the lower panel then what this would do to biomass for the ecosystem. Because the events become tighter and tighter in time and greater in magnitude, it should result in a significant reduction in biomass, just live biomass, that is, due to mortality. So let's think about these different events. Here's some great work that Tom Pugh helped us do in a paper we just published recently. Deforestation, the simple mortality from chainsaws has removed, give or take, 30% of the world's old growth since 1900. You can see this on the figure on the left, where the black line that's declining is the greater than 140-year-old or old growth forest distribution, forest area over time. And you can see it has gone down due to land use change and wood harvest. If you just look at land use change alone, that gives you the dashed lines. The blue line that's rising, the solid line then, is the increase in young forests. Now, Tom did a sensitivity analysis where he added approximate estimates of what disturbances, non-harvest disturbances, such as drought, insect outbreaks, wildfire, might do to these trends over time. And of course, what this could do, is shown by the shaded areas now, is greatly magnify the loss of forest area in the globe. One other way to show this imagery was done by the economists. They took our data and made these new figures. And I find them appealing because the figure on the left shows that basically you have an increase in young forest, the dark blue, and a decrease in old forest, the light blue. The figure on the right shows the declines in forest area by region. And it's really important to notice that the reason South America, which has enormous deforestation now, has the highest line here is because this data is normalized relative to the total forest area of the region. South America having an enormous amount of forest shows up with the higher line, where Europe has less forest to start with. Therefore, the amount of harvest that goes on is relatively more significant. Now, I've studied drought-induced mortality for about 15 years. However, recently we've been branching out into seawater exposure, and this has turned out to be fascinating. The observations of shoreline tree mortality are growing in many locations in the world. Now, just like drought or other types of mortality, we don't have a long-term baseline to say, really, is this accelerating or not? But the implications of an increase in sea level rise coupled with droughts could be driving these changes. The figure on the upper left then shows forest retreat from the coastline pre-1875 versus post-1875. And you can see a significant increase, at least for these 5 sites, in the loss of forest over time. Here's something that's going forward that could be a great challenge to forests, which is that decreasing soil moisture, or let's call it a soil drought, is likely. The figures shown here are, on the left is the business as usual CO2 emission scenario, whereas the one on the right is a reduced CO2 emission scenario. But either way, what we see here is the number of models that agreed on that severe soil moisture drought, meaning under 5% of the norm soil moisture, so very severe drought, would be predicted for that region. So you can see, for example, in the Amazon on the left-hand figure, South America, that most models agreed that there would be a doubling of the drought frequency. This is a bad omen for forests potentially. Now, in some locations where it's very, sorry about that, where it's very sunny or very wet and cloudy, such as in the tropics, some of the tropical wet forests, it could be that a bit more drought or a bit more sun is actually a good thing, getting back to the greenness indicator that we saw earlier in the tropics. So it may not be a bad thing everywhere, but in a lot of places it should be. Now, I don't have time to cover all these other disturbances that are impacting forests and reducing stand ages, but they are important. Wind may be going up in frequency and in intensity, such as through cyclones and hurricanes. Ice storms are predicted to increase, and we've seen evidence of their impacts. In the tropical rainforest, we see liana competition potentially increasing. Those are the vines that compete with trees and sometimes result in their death. So there's a number of other drivers that we haven't addressed. But one I want to focus on, because I think it's globally critical, is the chronically increasing atmospheric drivers. So I already showed you the figure in the upper right, but the figure in the middle right shows you how vapor pressure deficit, the red line, is going up over time and predicted to continue. Equally, we can see temperature going up in lockstep, as well as CO2 concentration. And then the drought frequency predictions are in the lower right. And again, you can see a bunch of models making predictions. You can see the mean trend of the orange line is increasing again for the soil drought frequency. These trending patterns could be significant drivers of increasing mortality. So what is VPD, vapor pressure deficit, and why does it matter? Well, it's like I said, it's the evaporative power of the atmosphere. On the figure on the left, let's just take the value at 25 Celsius in blue letter there. That's the saturated vapor pressure. In other words, that's the capacity of the atmosphere to hold water. Now, if your leaf, following the red line down to the 2.5 kilopascal down to the red dot, if your leaf is at that value down there of vapor pressure, you then have this large, the leaf is at 25, is at the blue, and the air is at the red. Either way, you see a large difference in vapor pressure there. That's that sucking power or evaporative power. Now, if you go up to 35 Celsius, such as with global warming, suddenly that evaporative power has nearly doubled, okay? That's a 10 Celsius increase, that's very large. But during droughts, this is the kind of which are associated with heat waves. This is the type of event we expect to see. So this increasing evaporative power then pulls more water potentially out of stomata, which are shown in the right-hand image. Now, this may not result in increased transpiration, but that would have to be incurred through stomatal closure, which reduces carbon assimilation. So either way, rising VPD is a negative challenge, a big challenge for plants. VPD tends to promote mortality, particularly of larger trees. This is one of my heavier figures with equations, but I just want to highlight the equation on the left. Stomatal conductance is a function of all these parameters. However, VPD is in the denominator of this equation. So as vapor pressure deficit goes up, stomatal conductance in theory declines. And this has been well validated through much data. That's shown the model results in the upper right-hand panel. Now, to maintain stomatal conductance at the ecosystem scale, these other parameters may need to change, right? And we don't know which parameters will change for sure. However, one of the easiest ways for trees to deal with rising vapor pressure deficit is to reduce their leaf area or to reduce their height. However, trees can't really get shorter. So the easiest, most thermodynamically efficient way to get shorter is to die. So this resulted in the hypothesis that particularly big trees should die at a higher frequency than small ones. And we might expect to see shifts from conifers to angiosperms and from trees to shrubs. Now, this is largely unvalidated. It's largely a hypothesis. However, there has been data suggesting that globally tall trees are dying more than short ones. This is shown in the imagery here. Both of those pictures can highlight the taller trees in those ecosystems died, whereas the shorter vegetation tended to survive. And also resulted in large vegetation composition shifts. The figure on the right shows the ratio of drought to control mortality rate versus tree size. And what you can see is that basically mortality rates increase the bigger the tree, right? Because, and this is very consistent across all of these different studies. Now, there are exceptions to this. The key point to make is that this is during drought. During non-drought periods, we often see U-shaped mortality curves. Nonetheless, this is some validation for the hypothesis that vapor pressure deficit plays a role and drought plays a role impacting mortality as a function of tree size. I'm not going to devote much time to wildfire, but just want to mention that it's growing globally, at least in some regions, not all regions, but in some regions. And it's due in part to rising vapor pressure deficit. Of course, it's also due to land management issues and many other factors. But vapor pressure deficit, as it rises, promotes more burning. The figure in the upper left shows the 2020 burned area for Western USA. And the figure in the middle shows that same burned area, and as well as the May through September vapor pressure deficit. The figure on the right shows the correlation of these two, and which is suggestive that vapor pressure deficit strongly affects burned area. And of course, we can see another example of rising vapor pressure deficit in the bottom figure. This is great work by an old postdoc of mine, Park Williams, continuing his excellent science. Insect outbreaks. It's depending on your estimates that have been provided, insect outbreaks can kill more trees than wildfires, at least in the Western USA, if not an equivalent amount. So that's a really large effect. Wildfires get a lot of attention because of their damage, but insect outbreaks actually are probably just as damaging. They just don't burn down houses, right? So this is an important factor. Again, we show temperature on the x-axis of the figure on the right. And as temperature goes up, the development rate of insects tends to go up. So there's some hypotheses and some expectations that insect attacks should increase, not only because of the impacts of temperature favorably on the growth of the insects, but also because there will be more stressed host trees across the landscape. So overall, what we generated as hypotheses in this particular paper was that the overall impacts should be increasing. Most of the drivers shown in the column on the left are increasing, if not flat. Very rarely are they declining. And the potential impacts, such as on mortality, shown in the red highlighted figure on the right, the red values for mortality are consistently increasing. Now, these are hypotheses, but they're based on a lot of literature and a lot of evidence. So what's the net impact? Mortality then reduces the average tree size and changes the vegetation composition. So what are the underlying mechanisms of mortality on a changing climate? I'm going to focus particularly on drought quite a bit here, because it's where we have the most evidence, but these mechanisms often extend potentially to other drivers, such as wind effects or harvest effects, etc. And I'll explain why in a minute. Now, one of the key things for prediction, which has been coming out of the society lately, is we need to understand characteristics at landscape to regional scales. For example, elevation and aspect. Higher elevations, at least in Western USA, tend to have lower mortality, presumably because they have higher moisture and lower vapor pressure deficit. This goes for aspect as well. Below ground water subsidies matter, rooting depth, soil texture, all of these affect the hydraulic system and the water relations of plants. Tree height, as I mentioned earlier, competition is a big question as to how much it really could affect mortality. Recent evidence from the tropics suggests it's not a major driver of the mortality. Nutrient availability, etc. So this slide highlights a progression of mechanistic frameworks over the last couple of decades. It started with a classic imagery on the upper left by Mannion et al., which I know you can't read all the details, but what it highlights is the role of pathogens and the interactions of pathogens with things like drought, with climate change, with soils. This was moved on to a more physiological process in the lower left by Jordi Martinez Belauta, which highlights the fluxes and pools that could lead to death. Subsequently, myself and some colleagues developed the figure in the top, as well as the multi-panel figure on the right, highlighting how carbon starvation and hydraulic failure may interact and are interdependent with each other and may lead to mortality. And most recently, Jordi and colleagues put out the idea on the far right, which is it really highlighted that pools of water and carbon, especially during a drought where they're declining, matter a lot to the survival of the plant. Now, before we go farther, carbon starvation is a challenging concept for our society. It's advanced a lot in the last decade, but at the same time, there's some confusion. So I want to highlight what I think, my opinion on the definition and a couple of key points. The definition is that carbon starvation is the process by which declining carbon supply rate to tissues of demand results in metabolic shifts that may or may not be reversible and may or may not lead to mortality. Carbon starvation is thus both a process and a potential endpoint. Now, this is important because it can be reversible. If you use the definitions that have been built globally for everything from amphibians to coral to humans regarding starvation, and including plants, most work on plants, this definition is consistent, specifically that it is reversible, may not lead to mortality, but it may lead to mortality. Now, carbohydrates provide incomplete evidence for carbon starvation. We have been using carbohydrates as a measure of carbon starvation for over a decade. However, the minimum carbohydrate level required for survival is unknown, but it's probably not zero. We shouldn't expect carbohydrates to go to zero just as evidence of carbon starvation. In other words, for example, maintaining water relations in plants requires osmoregulation, which is largely provided, at least sometimes 50% of osmoregulation comes from sugars. If those sugar availability declines, it may promote hydraulic failure. But we don't know if that's the case, and we don't know at what point that would occur. This is one of the grand challenges we face. And of course, as I've already highlighted, carbon starvation interacts with the water economy and defense against biotic agents because carbon is so important to both induced and constitutive defenses. So this figure I'm quite tired of. I think the whole world's tired of, but it's a little bit useful to conceptualize the next few slides I'm going to show. Basically, the idea here was that if you had a long drought event, you might be more likely to experience carbon starvation due to prolonged stomatal closure, which prevents photosynthesis. The idea was also that if you had an intense drought on the left-hand side, this would be more likely to cause hydraulic failure through the rapid loss of water prior to any carbon starvation really occurring in any extreme amounts because of the stores of carbon may outlast the ability of the plant to store the stores of water. So during drought, hydraulic failure is nearly universal and carbon starvation appears to be frequent. But which one killed the plant remains very challenging to understand. This is from Henry Adams et al., another great postdoc of mine, who looked at, took a literature review of all the studies where people killed plants on purpose via drought, and they measured both hydraulic failure and carbon starvation, at least those indices we have for those two parameters. And you can see here that in fact, all of the trees have hydraulic failure values greater than 60, meaning they're low, they have a lot of hydraulic failure. whereas carbon starvation actually goes on both sides of that dashed line. But most of the evidence of carbohydrates, I should call them, suggests that carbohydrates decline during drought. Whether or not this leads to mortality remains a challenge to figure out. I want to talk briefly about non-drought, about seawater induced mortality. You can see the imagery on the right hand, the photos. These are trees that are dying. The numbers on the trees are the crown surface area, or crown index we estimate via visual estimates. And you can see this progression of mortality across the transect. The trees are dying here because about 5 years ago, culverts were broken on purpose to allow salmon habitat, to allow fish to migrate upstream. But this also allows tidal flooding to occur in forests that were previously unexposed to saltwater. Intriguingly, you can see on the figure on the left that as trees approach death, in the weeks to death, as you go from right to left, the different tissues have starch values that decline radically. And if I can highlight to those of you interested, the intercepts for each of these tissues, like 0.11, 0.007, and 0.04, those are basically indistinguishable from zero, suggesting that these plants actually died truly of carbon starvation all the way to the point of complete carbon failure. This is something we haven't seen in drought studies. Typically in drought studies, plants die with a positive carbon situation, positive values of starch. So there's an interesting distinction here. And again, we can plot up the seawater induced mortality using the same framework here, where increasing hydraulic failure goes from 0 to 100 on the y-axis, and carbohydrates, here labeled non-structural carbohydrates, or NSC, also goes from 0 to 6. So and you can see in this case that the data really clumps in the upper right-hand corner of the figure. If you look at the figure on the left, then this is in the realm of carbon starvation. There's actually not that much hydraulic failure in this system. Now, this is a rainforest, and you might not expect to see much hydraulic failure in this system as well. But it is suggestive that trees that die from seawater exposure die in a different way than those of drought. I want to move on to challenges to understanding and prediction. Some models predict widespread conifer mortality, at least. What you can see here is 4 different Earth system models where they looked at and predicted, terrestrial biosphere models, where they looked at and predicted conifer mortality in the future in the next 100 years. Well, next 80 years at this point. And what you can see is red indicates the percentage change in conifer cover by 2100. So therefore, you can see in all 3, at least in the top 2 and the bottom figure, wide swaths of red coloring, suggesting extensive conifer mortality across the temperate zone. I would notice that the figure from Max Planck, the 3rd panel, actually had pretty widespread mortality as well. It's just that the growth rate in this particular model outweighed the mortality. This is equivalent to a large amount of carbon lost. Now, model predictions and observations do not necessarily agree, however. This is a big challenge. So the figure on the top is one of the ones I just showed you from one of the Earth system models. And you can see that the models predict an increasing boreal carbon sink, suggestive of increasing tree growth in the boreal zone, at least in some parts of the boreal. However, empirical data from tree rings and from inventory data sets, such as the one shown on the right, suggest that this is not what's occurring, that there's actually increased water stress in the boreal north, as well as increasing mortality. There's other evidence as well suggesting there's increasing mortality across, for example, Canada. So the data is inconsistent with the predictions, and this is a challenge for us to sort out. Another challenge is that global models that predict mortality from drought and heat don't necessarily do well at the regional scale compared to models developed for a specific region. Figure on the left shows what some very highly evaluated ecosystem process models suggest for southwestern USA mortality likelihoods in the future. Now, there are some assumptions buried in these models, of course, and the exact trend may not be as steep as we predict here. However, the trend is still in the same direction. Mortality probability is not going down, it's going up in southwestern USA. However, if you look at these four models that I previously showed you and zoom in on their regional predictions in the figures on the right, you can see that they predicted very little mortality in the Southwest. So if we want to be able to downscale our predictions, we have a big challenge here. One of the things I'm most excited about right now is the conflicting role of rising CO2 and rising vapor pressure deficit. Rising CO2 and the figure on the left should promote higher photosynthesis. Okay, this is what's shown for CO2 concentration on the x-axis and photosynthetic rate on the y-axis. It also can reduce water losses, which I didn't show here. So for both of those reasons, higher CO2 may actually help mitigate mortality rates. However, VPD is going up as well, as I explained earlier. And you can see here that photosynthesis goes down dramatically. This is for tropical forests in the Amazon. Goes down dramatically with rising vapor pressure deficit. So which one is going to win, the rising CO2 or the rising vapor pressure deficit? We don't know. But I would contend that the increasing mortality rates we see in some regions, as I showed at the beginning of the study, in these old growth type forests, could suggest that CO2 benefits are being outweighed by the temperature or VPD impacts. But really, this is still a hypothesis. So let's move on to some solutions to wrap up this talk. One solution is mechanistic modeling. And this is an example from a paper that myself and some colleagues are working on currently, where we simulated mortality from an observed mortality event in Switzerland, led by Matthias Ehrens, in Ansgar Common. And what they found here was that they observed a great degree of mortality and really extreme water potential values. So what we did was predict hydraulic failure indexed as percentage loss of conductance, or PLC, using 5 different models. And the punchline from these models is that you can see on the right-hand side, we did treatments of futuristic rising vapor pressure deficit, futuristic rising CO2, combining the two of those, and then of course, comparing those to the 2018 values when the trees died. Punchline here is that rising vapor pressure deficit definitely increases the likelihood of mortality. However, rising CO2 definitely decreases the likelihood of mortality, at least according to these ensemble results of these models. But when you combine CO2 and VPD, both rising as what is most likely to occur in the future, it's not that much higher of a mortality rate than compared to the 2018 values. It's a little higher, suggesting that, again, that vapor pressure deficit may outweigh the benefits of rising CO2, but not significantly in this analysis. Now, this again is just hypotheses. We don't know if these are accurate, but they're suggestive. Large-scale solutions include multi-scale remote sensing. This is an old image from the great work that's been led by Matt Hansen et al. Matt gave the first presentation to the Tree Mortality Network in January, actually. And this shows where disturbances have been occurring using Landsat scale estimates, and this has been done globally. And what it obviously makes you think is, where should we be studying? Where are the big events? Why do we see big events in different locations? So it's very appealing. And an exciting thing about this data sets is they're going to become long enough soon that we can actually look and see if there are trends over time in disturbance rates. Forest inventory data I mentioned earlier, it's our gold standard for looking at trends in vegetation dynamics. And you can see here again these regional patterns that are really interesting from these type of inventory data sets. So this again compels us to look at what is driving these various patterns. And also those two data sets, remote sensing, the inventory data sets, and this slide, the multi-factor manipulative experiments, are not good just only for understanding processes and patterns. They're also great for validating models, which allows us to make better prediction. In the case of these manipulative experiments, the one on the left is a project where we heated and droughted trees. The one on the right is a system where they're heating and elevating the CO2 in trees. These are great studies because they are the closest thing we can get to a future environment, right, in today's world. And they allow us to test hypotheses about how systems should respond to future conditions, or at least to part of the drivers of those future conditions. So I want to conclude by reminding everybody that it's a good time to visit forests, just like the glaciers and famous places like Glacier National Park are melting and disappearing, and it's a good time to see those places. It may be a good time to visit forests as well because we don't know what's going to happen. For example, in Sequoia National Park and in that region, there was massive disturbances in the last few years that killed these extremely old trees. So we need to enjoy them while we can. So in summary, tree mortality may be rising, but we need more data to really confirm that and actually to find out how that is globally. Of course, that's one of the major goals of the International Tree Mortality Network. So it's exciting to see that we might be converging on an approach to do this. This has great effects on the forests, including making them globally on average younger and shorter, potentially reducing the potential carbon storage and altering the water cycle. Most of these drivers are rising. Therefore, it's easy to suspect that mortality rates should be increasing in the future, unless there's something that we haven't thought of or a process that we're not capturing. And again, that may be that the CO2 benefits, for example, may partially or even entirely mitigate the VPD or precipitation impacts. The path forward is hard but clear. Observations, manipulations, simulations, and the interdependence of those three types of science. We have to connect those three types of science interdependently so that we can really advance our knowledge and our predictive capacity. I would like to acknowledge my funding sources, largely from the Department of Energy and from my institution at PNNL. They've been great supports. I'm going to conclude by mentioning that we're looking for a postdoc to study mortality in coastal systems. So if anybody's interested, please contact me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Hello. Thank you, Nate, for this very inspiring talk. I have now the honor to transfer the questions by the participants to you. And I have to say that we had more than 230 participants during your talk. So that's really amazing. So the first questions I want to start with, I think it's good to start with tree sizes and effects. So there have been a discussion already going on basically in the Q&A if tree size is really such a strong determinant of tree mortality. So one question is, for instance, asking, do you suggest that by Anke Jentsch, do you suggest that stem diameter is a good predictor rather than tree height? Or is it rather tree height? So what should be looked at when you want to understand drought sensitivity of different tree sizes?
Well, I think the question of tree height being a significant parameter in predictive capacity for mortality remains, like many things I said today, a hypothesis. There's some data to support it, but we need to get more data to really validate that. So regarding diameter versus height, to me, physiologically, what matters is height more than diameter. I mean, the fatter a tree, it may actually reduce their mortality rates if they have higher capacitance, for example. Who knows? But tree height, at least physiologically and theoretically and empirically, we know that the taller the tree, the more negative the water potentials, potentially, the more lower the photosynthetic rates. So they're already somewhat stressed compared to a short tree. So that's why we feel like the buffer between their functional state during a mean climate versus during a drought may be smaller. In other words, their hydraulic safety margin may be smaller.
Okay, thank you. Come to the next questions by Chao Yu. Why are conifers particularly vulnerable to drought? Is it because their location, so that they are imposed more by drought, or is it because of other aerodynamic conductance?
Well, it could be both of those plus multiple other reasons, I think. Let's back up for a second. I only showed models that predicted conifer mortality. So because we saw so much conifer mortality doesn't mean that we wouldn't see angiosperm mortality. We just didn't, that wasn't simulated in those. Nonetheless, there is some evidence that angiosperms, are, especially broadleaf plants, should do better than conifers, and that could be because conifers have a smaller range of plasticity. In other words, angiosperms can drop their leaves, whereas conifers cannot, at least in mass drops. And you've seen that in Europe, where the beech trees do these big leaf loss compared to the spruce, right? So that's an example of an acclimation, or maybe not an acclimation, but just a response, a plastic response that enables the angiosperms to avoid the severe drought, for example. So this is, again, is another hypothesis, but there's some evidence to support that.
So I like to ask there, do you think that this is more related to tree hydraulics than to carbon storage or carbon mechanisms in the trees?
Yeah, I was tempted to go into that a lot more today, but we're working on a manuscript now, myself and some great colleagues, where we're trying to get to the bottom of that and revise our framework. What we think, if I may speak for the group, is that at least during drought and perhaps during a lot of other events, the final step of death is rupture of cell membranes due to dehydration. Even your Christmas tree dies from this, right? So hydraulics are obviously extremely critical. The hydraulics also, and the water relations more broadly, strongly affect the carbon cycle. So they're highly interdependent. But the big question, getting to your question, is what's more important? I think that's impossible to say right now. Again, the requirements for carbon go up during drought. They don't go down necessarily. So carbon matters is what we're hypothesizing, and it could affect the hydraulics a lot.
Okay, thanks. Another question by Oliver Brandl. He asked, should not the rising CO2 positive effect on assimilation that we currently see even out when we reach the assimilation saturation point, and then we have still this continuous VPD effect that should keep increasing? Have you thought about this? I mean, when we go above 900 ppm or more?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I totally agree. I showed a curve earlier in the presentation of CO2 concentration on the x-axis versus photosynthesis on the y-axis, and what he's referring to is the curve saturates. So as CO2 in the atmosphere goes up, the benefits on photosynthesis actually slowly will decline relative to what they could at the prior years. Whereas VPD keeps going up. So by, let's say, 2200, a long time from now, those CO2 benefits may be really outweighed by vapor pressure deficit and temperature impacts. So that's a great point. I agree.
So staying with vapor pressure deficit, there's been a question by Lin Meng. She asked, do you think that high VPD is more important than low soil moisture? So is now low soil moisture rather causing tree mortality, or rather high VPD, or really the combination of both?
Well, we know that low soil moisture per se can kill a lot of trees, especially when it's coupled to the higher temperatures and higher VPDs we have now. We see that during drought events in Europe and the Amazon in North America. So I think getting back to the chronic versus episodic changes in mortality and the chronic versus episodic drivers, the decreasing soil moisture is a punctuated events. And certainly those are going to kill a lot of trees. But the slowly rising mortality rates we're seeing globally in non-disturbed forests, that may be driven more by vapor pressure deficit. I don't know. And I think the only way we're going to sort that out is with model analyses or experiments where we manipulate those two parameters. But I haven't heard of anyone really effectively manipulating vapor pressure deficit at the ecosystem scale yet.
Okay, more questions regarding prediction of tree mortality by Steve Kannenberg. He asks, it seems to me like our ability to predict which droughts result in mortality along with where and when is still very limited. In our view, what research do we need to move towards a more predictive understanding of drought-induced mortality?
Well, that's a big question and a great question and a hard question. I completely agree that especially at the regional scale, our predictions are challenging. Actually, from his group of people, they're actually advancing this very rapidly through doing regional scale modeling, for example, in aspen trees. So I think the key factors then to get things right are probably maps of soil depth. You know, that would be a huge first level approximator that matters. So we know the shallow soils tend to have, unless they have bedrock access to water, tend to have more mortality. The aspects, the topography, those things will all have to be part of regional models. Now, at the physiological scale, there's two approaches here. We can take the simple predictions and just say, look, we're getting a long ways in predicting mortality just with hydraulic failure. Not thinking about carbon, not thinking about insects, not thinking about other stuff. So maybe that's another great first level approach to this, is to take, that's not as simple science, but it's not as complicated as trying to bury all these carbon cycle components into the models as well. We have to be careful we don't improve the models past our knowledge, too far past our knowledge empirically, right? Because we can get into dangerous situations. But that's a great question. I really appreciate it. And I think that's one of our grandest challenges that we're all facing here.
There's another question which I find also very interesting. This is by Marco Lariavara. I'm sorry for mispronunciation of the name, I guess. If mortality is increasing due to global change, could this be only temporary and be reversed later when species and genotypes suitable to the new environment occupy the site? Could this potentially lead to a higher biomass after the transitionary phase?
I think it's a great point, you know, and in long time ago in the paleo record, there's plenty of evidence that warmer climates sometimes would have much higher biomass, so more tropical forests, for example. The thing we're facing now is that the rate of climate change and the rate of change of disturbance potentially increasing, the likelihood of more disturbances as climate warming continues to rise is much more severe than the rate of changes usually in the past. So when you had much slower climate warming in the past, the vegetation could, let's say, keep up. And so the migration might be fast enough to really achieve what you're talking about. The thing now is that it's happening so fast that migration is just too slow, unless it's assisted migration. Migration, it just seems too slow to keep up with the rate of climate warming. So this results in something Craig Allen used to call weed world, which is a large, you know, a chunk of land that's lost its forest or lost its main trees, but it hasn't had migration in of more thermally tolerant species, for example. So I think it's a great point, and someday if we ever achieve a new steady state climate, yeah. But with a chronically rising, changing climate with no end in sight, it's hard to see any sort of stable, steady state coming anytime soon.
Thank you very much for this. And I thank all the participants for their questions. But unfortunately, we cannot ask all of them. So we have to just randomly pick some. And this is also hard work by all the other people in the background. And I really like to thank you all again for attending today. And I think that was very inspiring and very impressive. And with this, we hope to see you again in 6 to 8 weeks for our next seminar. Please take a look on our webpage and we keep you updated.
And thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks, Nate. Thanks, everyone,
Nate.
for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See you guys.